Before we dive into CSF production and flow, let's remind ourselves of what CSF is. CSF, or cerebrospinal fluid, is the liquid that we find within the ventricles and the subarachnoid space of the central nervous system. It will serve three functions. It will allow the brain to be more buoyant inside the cranial cavity. It will act as a protective barrier. And then it's also going to transport nutrients and waste materials. So now let's talk about where it comes from and how it flows throughout the central nervous system. Here I have a model of the ventricles. This is a cast of the spaces inside the brain. So I know I have a physical solid structure here, but this is representative of cavity spaces. And I know this is kind of one of the hardest things for students to visualize. I know it was for me. And so what I like to do is just imagine, and again, this doesn't fit exactly, and this is not to scale with this model, but this model right here would fit into this space right here. So you can see this is much bigger, but if I were just to kind of loosely show you how it fits together, just like that, and then these would go into each cerebral hemisphere so that the halves could come together. Now you can kind of understand how this fits in the big picture. We have 4 ventricles shown here. So before we go into that, let's remind ourselves that this is anterior, this is posterior. Again, if I were just to kind of lie this like this, it looks like that. These 2 ventricles are called the lateral ventricles, or the first and second. We don't put a specific number to a specific lateral ventricle because it doesn't really matter. But specifically, you would call this one the left lateral ventricle, and this one is the right lateral ventricle. And then they're going to come into this area right here called the third ventricle. So my fingers right now are covering up the third ventricle. And on this view, maybe this will be a little bit easier if I do it like this. You can see that my finger is behind the third ventricle. And then right here, this portion right here kind of looks like the neck of this bird. That is the cerebral aqueduct. We also see this as the mesencephalic aqueduct, especially when we're looking at animal specimens. But that's that little tunnel right there. And then this portion right here is the fourth ventricle. If we were to kind of loosely associate it with this brain model right here, you could see that this shape, that is the cerebral aqueduct on the model. Kind of looks like what we have right here on the ventricle model. And then this little triangular shape, that is the fourth ventricle. I like to tell students that the fourth ventricle is associated with that cerebellum. That's kind of the easiest way to see it. And so likewise, you can see it just like that. If we were to look at the flow of CSF, we need to start within the choroid plexuses. And on this model, all these little pink squiggles are representative of those choroid plexuses. You can see that they are located within all ventricles. And those are composed of ependymal cells, and those are the actual structures that create that CSF flow. But for order's sake, or just learning this, if we were, realize that there's CSF in all of the ventricles and the subarachnoid space all the time. But if we just kind of wanted to take a more stepwise approach to learning these structures, we could arbitrarily start with the lateral ventricles. So we would say, okay, CSF is created by the choroid plexuses, and it will be in the left and the right lateral ventricles. Then from there, that CSF will flow into the third ventricle. From there, CSF would go into the mesencephalic aqueduct, or the cerebral aqueduct. And then from there, it would go into the fourth ventricle. So beyond the fourth ventricle, let me grab another model to show you how that fits together with the subarachnoid space. All right, so on this model here, here's that cerebral aqueduct, that fourth ventricle, and then it will go into the subarachnoid space, which remember, the arachnoid mater is the middle meninx, the middle meningeal layer, and beneath that is the space called the subarachnoid space. And on this model, that would be represented by this white line right here. For my students in your lab manual, that is colored blue. And we have these apertures within the fourth ventricle, 2 lateral and a median aperture, and that is how CSF gets from the ventricles to that subarachnoid space. If you'll recall, when I went over the spinal cord, that's when I first told you that I wanted you to know that CSF flows through the subarachnoid space, and this is how it got into that space. So now that is going to flow in the subarachnoid space around the brain. Again, on this model, that would be this white line right here. And then from the fourth ventricle, that will actually continue down into the central canal. So again, from my video, or one of my videos on the spinal cord, when I pointed out the central canal of the spinal cord, that is how CSF got into that area right there. So it originated in this area by the fourth ventricle. From the subarachnoid space, we're going to have these little structures called arachnoid villi, which are little projections that go from the subarachnoid space through the dura mater, because remember, the dura mater is outside of the arachnoid mater. It will go through the dura mater into this space called the dural venous sinus, dural venous sinus. And any extra CSF we have will go through that sinus space. So for my students, that's what we've shown the color orange. And that excess CSF will then get recirculated into the venous blood flow. The pressure within the subarachnoid space is going to be higher than it is in the dural venous sinus, or it's also known as the superior sagittal sinus, which will ensure that CSF flows into that superior sagittal sinus and not back the other way. So let's quickly review using this model the order of CSF production and flow. Remember that CSF will be produced within the choroid plexuses, but if we had a starting place, we would say it will start in the lateral ventricles and then go into the third ventricle. From the third ventricle, it will go into the cerebral aqueduct, then the fourth ventricle. From the fourth ventricle, it will go into the subarachnoid space, and then from the subarachnoid space, it will go through those arachnoid villi and then into the dural venous sinus or the superior sagittal sinus. So I hope studying that in a stepwise format helps you learn this. Let me know in the comments if you have any questions or comments, and I'll see you in the next video.